Hey everybody, welcome to week 3 of the class. And this week we're going to be looking at voting. And just to outline where we're going to go in this week's lectures, obviously this is theories of voting behavior, so we're going to be focusing on voters for this particular lecture. The other lectures in this week are going to look at parties, candidates and campaigns, and interest groups and how they interact with the electoral system and how they behave and what they're up to and what they think about. And then the last lecture is going to kind of wrap up and look at what voting does and doesn't do in terms of its impact on our system of governance. So one thing I just want to note is that today we're going to look at, or not today, but in this particular mini lecture, I'm going to look at voters' behavior. And as you can see from the notes, I'm going to look at the ideal citizen in air quotes and then the actual citizen. Obviously, voting is extremely important in any democratic system. In fact, it is often overplayed. The importance of it is often overplayed. I think that one of the things about our particular political culture is that we have a very, what I think of as ballot-centric political outlook. Citizens think of themselves as people who vote, and that is our duty or responsibility or our power as citizens is to vote, and then that's it. There are obviously many other mechanisms for citizens interacting with the political system, attempting to influence the government, interacting with each other. Now, right now we're living in a moment where there's a lot of protesting going on, and that's actually an important component of citizenship. So is running for office, so is donating money, so is getting involved as an activist in other ways besides protesting, knocking on doors when that's the thing that's available, donating your time to either political groups or private charities, trying to lobby lawmakers by going and testifying at a committee or going and having a rally. There are lots and lots of ways, talking to your neighbors or coworkers about politics. These are all ways in which citizens interact with the political system, either as a sort of give and take between citizens and the government or as a direct attempt to influence what's going on. This class is going to, at least this particular week especially, is focusing on voters, but I just want to point out that this is only one nexus between citizens and the government. Now, it is a really, really important one in a democracy, but democracy is not just voting. Democracy is not just majority rules. Democracy is the will of the people being manifested in the rules that are made and enforced over the people by the government that they are in charge of, the people are. It's obviously very important, and so I just want to say all that and note that voting is often seen as the beginning and end not only of citizenship but of politics, but it is just one mechanism, obviously very important. So, given that most citizens think of themselves primarily as voters, how do people vote? And how do they decide? What is the thought process? Now, I'm just going to kind of preview what I have up here already, which is there's an ideal citizen model, and I want to talk about that for just a few minutes. And then there are the actual citizen, the various personality types. There is really no one way in which people make voting decisions. Part of the problem, I think, with the ideal citizen notion is that there should be one way that people make voting decisions. That the closer to the ideal citizen that we are, the more correct we are as a citizen of a democratic society. I reject that notion as a sort of moral guideline. Like there's an ideal and we should live up to it, and a democratic society is less healthy the less its citizenry lives up to the ideal citizen model. Not only is the ideal citizen model very burdensome, as I'll talk about in a minute, it's actually not the only way I think it's reasonable for a citizen of a democratic society to go about thinking about what their vote is. I think that any of these methods are reasonable. Some I would say are, maybe stronger in terms of getting what you want out of politics than others are, but they're all totally reasonable ways that people can go about making their decisions. It's very difficult not to judge other voters for thinking about their vote in a way that you don't think about it. I've been teaching politics for a long time, and I've heard year after year from people who are frustrated that their side isn't winning, that people aren't voting their interests, people aren't voting rationally, people aren't paying attention. What this is this frustration where you're saying if only everyone else, all these other people, approached the voting decision the way I do and the people that I agree with, then we would win all the time. And that's probably true. It's true for other people as well. If only you voted the way they did, they would win all the time as well. But to me, it represents this idea that there's a right way to vote, and I'm annoyed and pissed even and outraged that other people aren't following that right way. Okay, so what is the ideal citizen model? The implicit philosophical Platonic ideal of what the citizen is. The ideal citizen is rational, well-informed, and open-minded. Now, these are all good things. I certainly don't want to run down these traits and say the ideal citizen is actually a bad thing. But they are not the only ways that you can go about being a voter. And also, in a way, they're very difficult and burdensome. And sometimes an ideal that is too lofty can be destructive rather than beneficial. And it's nice to have ideals and values to live up to so that you can know when you're falling short and when you're not living up to your own values. But values and ideals can sometimes also make you or your society beat itself up. What is a rational citizen? Well, in this model, a rational citizen is self-interested, strategic, and instrumental, right? Self-interested means that they use their vote to pursue and advance their personal interests. Now, I do want to note for anybody who's not also in the interest group class, where I talk about this quite a bit, and if you are, you already know this part, but interests can very much sound like selfishness, or self-interest can sound like you just want to get more of your slice of the pie, right? And it can be some of that. Interests are often material benefits, right? So for example, if you're a worker, one of your interests is in higher pay, better working conditions, shorter hours, better benefits. If you're an employer, your interests are less regulation, less requirements for benefits and pay, fewer taxes, fewer impediments to maximizing profit. Those are interests as defined by material benefits. And those are obviously very important. But the ideal citizen model doesn't say that we actually have to be materially rational, self-interested in the way that we want to make ourselves materially better off. In our culture, our pretty materialist, consumer-oriented culture, it's more than just that, but it has a big aspect of materialism. It can be very easy to think of interests as equivalent to material benefit interests. But the other type of interests are values. Things that you believe in, the way that you think the world should be. And sometimes your values and your material benefits will line up, right? Like, if one of your values is that you think that there ought to be a high level of material equality in the world, so that there's less gap between the rich and the poor, and policies that would advance that ideal also happen to make you materially better off because maybe you're a poor person or you're lower middle class or you're a struggling worker. Your material interests and your value interests can line up, but they don't have to. And in some cases, people have to sacrifice their material benefits for their values. Now, the people who vote based on their values, their value interests, for example, people who believe that abortion is murder and vote on that are basically voting on their own their own value interests. Sometimes you have to sacrifice your own material interests for your values. If pro-life candidates are also candidates who are recommending, say, tax cuts or cuts to social programs that you personally benefit from, voting for somebody who advances the pro-life agenda will advance an economic agenda that hurts you materially. And people do that. Now, and I bring up this specific example because one of the things that often outrages people is when someone says, but you're voting against your own interests, you're making yourself worse off. Usually what they mean is, I want you to think about your material interests, or I want you to think about your value interests, and you're thinking about the other one. You're making yourself worse off, right? If you vote for a pro-life candidate who then cuts taxes on the wealthy and that reduces the money that's available for social programs that you personally or your family or your community rely on or they help you, you are in one sense voting against your interests because you're voting against your material interests, but you're voting for your interests because you're voting for your value interests. One of the things is that even the ideal citizen, is at this rational level, is complicated. And what is problematic is that often when people see the word rational, they think of it in a very specific version of rationality, right? Like rational is what advances your material interests. That's one version of rational, but it's not the only version of rational for sure. So the ideal citizen votes, behaves, interacts with the political system, attempting to advance their interests, however they define their interests. One of the things that we know about a democratic society that has any level of diversity at all is that those interests will be multiple, they'll be diverse, they'll be clashing, and part of what a democratic system is a battle over which interests are going to win. And in a democratic society, because there are frequent elections, you win now, but you might lose later, and if you're a loser, then in this particular battle, you can keep fighting on to try to advance your interests, and that's what democratic politics are. Now, well-informed and open-minded are really essentially just helper values or helper traits to the rational, right? If you're going to, if the idea is the ideal citizen is interacting with politics, particularly the voting system, in a way that will advance their interests, however they define those interests, then you ought to be well informed. Because if you're not well informed, how can you be strategic? How can you be self-interested? How can you actually use your vote and your other political activities, but in this case your vote, to get your interests advanced if you don't know what the facts are, right? If you don't know what the consequences of policies are, if you don't know who stands for what, if you don't know what they propose, if you don't know what's been done in the past, if you don't know what the state of policy is currently, how can you possibly vote effectively, right? The rational ideal citizen is somebody whose vote is an effective, doesn't mean they win all the time, but it's an attempt to be effectively moving towards the ideal, your interests. Open-minded goes along with well-informed because basically, if you're not open-minded, if you're not willing to see the different options and open-mindedly evaluate all of them for which ones best advance your interests, then you're not really going to be successful at advancing your interests. You're not going to be very rational. A rational person should be open-minded in this sense, not because toleration is a moral value, but because openness to different options means that you are much more likely to find the option which works for you. So when, for example, in a two-party system, if there's a Republican and a Democrat, and you're just like, no Democrat's ever going to advance my interests, then you're not being open-minded. And it may be true that that very few Democrats would ever advance your interests. But if you're not actually open to the possibility that a Democrat would, then you're not going to be a very rational citizen. You're going to vote for all Republicans, and sometimes they're going to advance things that don't work for you, and not just your material interests, but whatever you think your interests happen to be. So well-informed and open-minded kind of go together as helper values to be rational. And rational means self-interested and strategic. Your vote in the ideal citizen model is a commodity that you use to advance your interests as effectively as possible. And if you win, great, but you have to keep advancing them by voting and getting and winning more, increase or winning every time or as much as possible. If you lose, you're not totally dead. You have another chance to try to win again in the future. So that's the ideal citizen. Now, it doesn't sound terrible. Like I know I started this by saying, oh, it's this lofty ideal. The problem is that we have so many things to vote on, and there's so much information, and there are so many potential options. Even in a two-party system, there are all kinds of policy options. There's so much that would be needed to be absorbed to be the well-informed citizen. Open-minded is pretty easy, right? Though it means seeking, a lot of times being open-minded means being aggressive, like you have to go out and find out what the options are. If you're only being shown two options, but there are more out there, to be truly open-minded, you have to aggressively go after it. To be the ideal citizen can be a very time-consuming, draining endeavor, and if we had nothing else to do, it would be doable. But obviously people have other things to do with their lives. And this is one of the things about voting, is that you get one vote. And there are, depending on what you're voting in, there are thousands or tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of other people voting. Your vote is really ultimately kind of insignificant. So if you don't want to pour time and energy into being particularly well-informed as a voter, because you're like, yeah, I'm gonna vote, but like, how much time should I really spend on this? 1 out of a million, or 160 million people will cast ballots for the presidential election probably. Several million will cast ballots in statewide elections for governor. And like, what's my one vote going to do? So I'll spend some time, and I'm not going to like basically put on the mask of the ideal citizen. Now, if you're not going to spend all the time that it takes to be the ideal well-informed citizen, you can either not vote, and certainly some people do that. Roughly a third to half of people don't vote in elections, and that, while that might seem like an idiotic choice, right? Like, voting is so simple. You just mark a ballot, and there you go. And why not? Why not vote, right? Well, if there were no obstacles to casting your ballot, then that would be a legitimate argument. But there are, in the real world that we live in, there are obstacles. There are lines. There are, now there's health concerns. There are material resources needed to get to the polling place. There is the need for you to go to your job and take care of your family. There are genuine obstacles to voting that can easily outweigh the benefit of casting your one single vote. So the choice not to vote is actually, while many people don't necessarily make that choice in that kind of cost-benefit type of way, the choice not to vote is a legitimate and understandable choice. And one of the things is that when we start looking at the elections from the point of view of parties and candidates don't always want everybody to vote. They really don't. They want the people who are going to vote for them to vote. So they're not interested in maximizing voter turnout. They're interested in maximizing the voter turnout of their supporters. So parties and politicians have an interest in having people not have an easy time voting, creating obstacles, or at least allowing there to be obstacles, not clearing away the obstacles to voting. But also, let's say you are going to vote. You're like, okay, you know what? I'm going to wait. I'm going to drive across town. I'm going to take the bus across town. Take half a day off from work. I'm going to wait in line for 4 hours. If that's what it takes to cast my vote, I'm going to do that. That's a powerful citizen. That's a good idea. Like, that's a great attitude towards voting, though. As I say, not the only one. If you said, you know what, my one vote, I'm not going to take half a day off, take the bus across town, and wait 4 hours in line during a coronavirus pandemic to cast my one pretty meaningless vote. That's also totally understandable. The ideal citizen model would say, no, you're a bad citizen because you don't vote. But I'm trying to push back against that. But if you're not going to do all that you can to be the most well-informed possible, you're going to follow a rule of thumb. And the actual citizen follows rules of thumb. And the rules of thumb, they either develop consciously by saying, okay, well, what's the best shortcut to making my vote the closest to the ideal version possible? And what is, what feels comfortable to me, what's easy to me. Some people consciously think about that. Other people just kind of behave into it based on their sort of normal way of going about making up rules of thumb. We all have rules of thumb for all kinds of stuff that we do. Now, the personality types that I put it in quotes is not really strictly personality traits like introvert or extrovert or sociable or communicative, whatever the different personality types are, judging, perceiving, all of those different personality tests that tell you what your personality type is. These are basically, voter personality types are, what kind of rules of thumb do you tend to use and gravitate towards in order to decide who and what to vote for without pouring time and energy into being the ideal citizen? These are the main ones. There are other ways that people do it. There are sort of minor, trivial personality types, but I'm just going to go through the main personality types and what they think about when they vote. When I'm going through this, think about yourself. Think about which of these personality types you tend to lean more towards. Also think about your judgments about other voters when they're exhibiting a personality type that isn't yours, and you think they're bad, they're wrong, they're duped or deceived. Really, that's a judgment that's coming from the fact that you are saying my personality type of voter is the right personality type. And probably a lot of those people are doing that back at you, but that judgment isn't necessarily the best one. And I think I've pushed back against these judgments of other voters enough, so I'll try to avoid saying too much more of it in the rest of this lecture. The ideological voter is a person who votes based on the expressed values of the candidates or if they're voting on a ballot measure, like what to vote for, vote yes or no on a ballot measure, on essentially what that ballot measure expresses in terms of a value. So, for example, if you're an ideological voter and there's a ballot measure to legalize marijuana, you're going to say, okay, I'm a libertarian and legalizing marijuana lines up with my libertarian beliefs, so I'm going to vote for it. Or, I'm a person who believes that the government has a responsibility to create a decent society, and marijuana is a drug that doesn't create a decent society, so I'm going to vote against it. When you're talking about candidates, ideological voters will tend to gravitate towards candidates whose expressed values line up with their expressed value. I am an evangelical social conservative. I want to vote for people who either are evangelical social conservatives or who have expressed support for the positions that evangelical social conservatives want to express. Or I'm a progressive person, I'm a socialist, or I'm a libertarian, and I'm going to gravitate towards people who have expressed values at the highest end. Now, in a way, you're being a rational voter, because what you're doing is you're being a values-based voter. The term values voter in American political culture often conveys to people religious right, because that term was used to describe those voters. That was actually sort of the origin of that term. But a values voter is essentially an ideological voter. It's a person who votes based on whether the values they hold that are important to them, their political values, their philosophical values, their religious values, their social values, line up with the candidates and the ballot measures that they are being asked to vote on. Values voter is often a disparaging term from people who aren't religious conservatives, but if you're a progressive liberal who votes for people who are progressive liberals because they're progressive liberals, you're also a values voter. You're a different personality type of value voter than the values voter who's the social conservative who votes for socially conservative candidates because they uphold their values. But if you pick a candidate because you're super pro-choice and fully in favor of reproductive rights, and that value matters the most to you, that's the thing that you're going to evaluate candidates based on, then you're a values voter just as much as somebody who votes for pro-life candidates who want to restrict reproductive rights and abortion access is a values voter as well. So ideological voters are values voters. And values voters could actually be moderate too. Like, you could vote for somebody because your value is pragmatic, compromising, moderate policy. And you look for people who are like that and who express that that's what they're going to try to do, right? That is also, you can be a middle-of-the-road values voter too. Values voters aren't necessarily just ideologically extreme. It's what are you evaluating? Now, partisan voters are people who vote based on party label. Now, it might seem like a partisan voter and an ideological voter are the same, and they often do, the Venn diagram of these two overlaps quite a bit in terms of the specific choices that they make. But a partisan voter is not looking at the expressed values of the candidate. They are looking at the party label. And they're saying to themselves, this is the process, either conscious or unconscious, that they've gone through. And I think it's often a conscious process, if not necessarily a stupendously time-consuming conscious process. But they're like, which of these parties generally, it stands for things that I stand for, right? So yeah, I tend to stand for low taxes, less government intervention, personal freedom, capitalism. I believe in these things. Which of these? Republican Party, typically. Now, so I'm just going to vote for the Republican. My shortcut is going to be a single letter, a D or an R. Now, you might think like that's so far from the ideal citizen. That's not well-informed. That's not open-minded at all. There's definitely a lot of not open-mindedness to that, for sure. If you never vote for a Republican because you're a Democrat, or you never vote for a Democrat because you're a Republican, you're not really adhering to the open-minded value. But you might be right that for the most part, when you vote for the D or the R that you line up with, that you're getting what you want, right? That you could spend hours more researching and you would still end up voting for the Republican every time, or you would end up voting for the Democrat every time. Or you would vote for the Republican 90% of the time, and so why not just save yourself all that time and round up and vote for the Republican 100% of the time? Now, as I say, partisan and ideological voters, the Venn diagram overlaps quite a bit, and that's largely because the two parties have sorted themselves along clear ideological lines over the last couple decades. Over the course of American history, the parties have sort of drifted together and apart several different times, so that at certain points, being a party voter meant you weren't actually being an ideological voter very much at all. You were really being a party loyalist. And in other periods, like the period we're living through right now, when you're a party loyalist, you're also an ideological loyalist, right? If you're a Democrat, then you're a liberal. If you're a Republican, then you're a conservative. Not 100% of the time, because people follow other rules, but those things line up nicely. I've lived through and taught politics long enough that I've actually seen one of those shifts. When I first started teaching politics in the early 90s, one of the biggest complaints, which now seems extraordinarily quaint, is that the two parties weren't different enough, that it was basically a one-party system. They were more or less the same. There wasn't a big ideological split between Republicans and Democrats. So partisan voters in the 90s were basically team loyalists. You know, it's like, why be a Seahawks fan instead of a Green Bay Packers fan, right? It's just about loyalty to a team. A lot of times it's regional loyalty, like, well, I lived in Seattle, or I lived in Wisconsin, or I lived in the Midwest. It's not that one team aligns with your values anymore. They're basically the same, right? Any football team is the same. When the parties are more or less the same, when the Venn diagram of their policies and ideologies overlaps an awful lot, partisan voters don't look like ideological voters. And a lot of times then ideological voters would feel left out. They're like, well, in a two-party system, where the two parties are more or less the same, how do I make my choice? In the 90s, people were like, the two parties are too similar, so I don't even really have a realistic choice. Now people complain that the two parties are too different. And that's actually one of the things, having taught politics for a long time, people will always find something to complain about politics. I think that's just kind of a given. But not that makes people stupid or bad or anything, it's just kind of a given of human nature. But right now, these two line up, but they are different personality types. I'm really fundamentally, I'm a partisan voter. I'm a loyal Democrat. And mostly it's because the Democratic Party, for all the things I don't necessarily agree with it about and all the ways in which I'm disappointed in the Democratic Party, basically, the Democratic Party is going to advance the things that I want more or less. And so I'm just comfortable saying I'm just going to vote Democratic all the time, because that is, on average, going to advance my interests and values and ideas very successfully. The next personality type is the reactive voter. Now, reactivity sounds terrible, right? It sounds like, if somebody says you're a reactive person, what that conveys is that somebody says something and you react to it without thinking. You're usually emotional and hot-headed and not very thoughtful. The reactive voter personality type is not that. In fact, the reactive voter is a person who looks at the current circumstances and reacts to the current circumstances as a way of deciding who to vote for. And typically what a reactive voter does is they look at the ins, the incumbents, the people who are running things, the majority party in Congress, the party of the president, the party of the governor, the party of the mayor, or whoever it is, that whatever office they're voting for. They look at the ins and they react to how the ins are doing in the current circumstances. If things are going well, the reactive voter is apt to give the ins more chance, more time. If things are going poorly, then the reactive voter is apt to vote for the other party and to vote to give the outs a chance to become the ins. A lot of American voters are reactive voters, or at least some of the very most important voters, the swing voters, and I'll talk about those in a future lecture, are reactive voters. And in a way, reactivity, whereas like in our personal interactions, reactivity is not a good thing, because it means you're hot-headed, you're being emotional, you're too quickly reacting to things instead of reflectively responding to things that come at you that are said or done. The reactive voter is actually quite thoughtful. They're saying, okay, what's the world look like right now from my perspective? Do I feel like the country's moving in the right direction? Do I feel like the state is moving in the right direction? Do I feel like I have a high level of security? Do I feel like my prospects and my children's prospects and my community's prospects are looking up? And let's say that there's a Republican governor, and I'm a Democrat, and I voted for the Democrat in the previous election, but I'm a reactive voter who looks around and says, yeah, I didn't vote for this person, but things are pretty good, so I'm going to vote for the Republican this time. I want the ins are in, and they seem to be doing okay. Let's give them more of a chance. Or things are terrible. Let's get these bums out and get the other guys in, give them a shot, right? And one of the reasons why I know that a giant portion of Americans are reactive voters is that we do have swings, we have cycles, and it's kind of a piece of conventional wisdom that the party that wins is going to get a certain amount of time to succeed and please people, and if they take too much time to get the policies enacted they promised, or if they screw things up, or if there's an economic crisis or a health crisis or a national security crisis, then they're going to get blamed for it. And it's not really completely ridiculous to blame the ins for things going badly. So reactive voters are going to say, what do the current circumstances look like? Now, emotional voters are people who really aren't looking at the state of play, and they're not necessarily even looking at the party or the ideology of the candidate. So I think party and ideology will play into the emotions. Emotional voters are reacting to campaign messaging. Most campaign messaging is aimed at moving and activating the emotions of voters. Typically negative emotions, fear, uncertainty, anger, insecurity, but also positive emotions as well, like hope, rationality, sensibility, whatever positive emotions can be activated. Campaigns tend to be, with their messaging, they tend to be trying to activate people's emotions because really, given how far most people are from the ideal citizen of being rational, our emotions are a much easier, more cost-effective decision-making trigger that if you can trigger an emotion and get somebody to decide one way or the other, you're going to be more successful. We'll see a little bit about this in the lecture on campaigns. But emotional voters are people who give themselves over to their responses, not to the current circumstances, but to the messaging of the campaign. Reactive voters are also essentially giving themselves over to emotional responses, but they're responding typically with a mixture of emotion about the current circumstance, like, oh, I feel uncertain. Uncertain's an emotion. And then they also have information like, yeah, like my pay hasn't gone up very well, or I know a lot of people who are unemployed. This is a pretty unstable time. I want to vote for the Outs and give them a chance. So reactive voters aren't necessarily just purely rationally looking at the current circumstances. They're using a mixture of rational information processing and emotional processing. Emotional voters are essentially looking at the messaging that's coming at them. They're responding to advertising. Now, campaigns are going to focus a lot on these people because these are really the most persuadable voters. And many elections are won by getting the persuadable voters on your side. Now, current circumstances will make the campaign messaging for one side or the other easier or more difficult, right? It's going to be right now because we have a Republican president and because we have a Republican Senate and we had a Republican Congress for a while. It's going to be much easier for Democratic candidates from the president on down to use campaign messaging that's going to play on the emotions of anger and fear and uncertainty and dissatisfaction, all those negative emotions, aimed at the current ends. And so emotional campaigning messaging will often try to get people to be reactive through their emotions. Republicans are going to have a harder time messaging, but they're going to do the same thing. They're going to play on usually fears, but also hopes. Like, fears of like, it could be worse. Like, you think that it's bad with Republicans in control. Here's what it's going to look like with Democrats in control, right? So that's where the campaign messaging is going to be aimed at activating those particular kinds of fears and uncertainties. But or also hopes, or like, when coronavirus is gone, don't you want Republicans in control so that we can rebuild the economy, right? That's a positive, a hopefulness messaging. So campaign messaging will be emotionally oriented, but it does have to take into account current circumstances. And I'll talk about that a little bit in the campaign lecture that's coming up. The rational voter, in what I've called, is not necessarily the ideal citizen, but the rational voter is a voter who uses their rationality and aims at policies. And they're going to say, okay, which policies do I favor, and which people are likely to advance those policies as opposed to either ignore those policies or go in the opposite direction, right? Like, I want more school funding because I have little kids and I want as good of a school system as possible. Who's going to give me that? There could be some emotional reaction there could be some reactivity, but basically it's an analysis of policy at a rational level. Now, as you can see, I have 2 bullet points here because the rational voters come in 2 stripes. single issue voters who care about one set of policies, and multi-issue voters who care about a lot of policies. Single issue voters tend to be stable in the sense that from one cycle to another, the important issue or issues, because even though the term is single issue voters can sometimes be like 2 or 3 issues, but those are the only ones that don't pay attention to anything else. Usually those single issue voters are one issue. Reproductive rights, gun control, taxation, education funding, healthcare, right? Now, single issue voters tend to be stable from one cycle to another, and that's because policies in one area matter most to them, right? It's not that they don't care about policy in other areas, it's just that the list of their policy priorities go, here's my #1 priority, and then it's a distant second, a distant third, a distant fourth. Multi-issue voters are people who have 3, 4, 5, multiple policies at the top of their list that jockey for importance, or there's like 4 of them are tied for first, or there's a clear first, but there's a set of 4 close seconds. And what rational voters will do then, and this is actually, it's harder to be a rational multi-issue voter because you then have to do not only a lot of research to find out which candidates and ballot measures are going to advance your policies most likely, you then have to decide, well, given that I can't probably find one perfect candidate who agrees with me on all of the issues, which of these are the most important, right? It's like, okay, here's a candidate who on 6 important issues to me agrees with me on 4 of them, but the 2 that they disagree with me are my top 2, but the other 4 are a close second. Like, how do I do that? These are also persuadable voters, though unlike the emotional voters, they're not going to be as susceptible to campaign messaging. Campaigns will try to speak to the issues and speak to policies. They will do that, but it's not the primary form of communication that campaigns engage in. It's a difficult one because you can give tons of information and many people aren't even going to process it, but also you're only really speaking to the multi-issue rational voters, and that's a pretty small group. From the point of view of a campaign, it's not a great use of resources to spend a lot of your messaging on those people. So rational multi-issue voters are the people who are actually going to come closest to the ideal citizen in that they're going to do the most research, they're going to do the most thinking. And to be a rational multi-issue voter is to make a commitment to be closer to the ideal citizen. I hope you see that these other personality types are totally sensible, especially if you're a reactive voter and these 2 can overlap quite a bit. You're going to react to current circumstances based on particular areas that matter to you, right? Like if education policy matters to you the most, and the education system seems to be just fine even if the economy is doing poorly, then you're going to go with the ins. If the economy matters the most to you, if you're a single issue economy voter, then you're going to also be often a reactive voter who reacts to the state of the economy at that particular moment. Now, last one here is the hybrid, and I think this is actually, while it seems possibly like this is the most common that people kind of combine these things, I think it's actually not that common. I think people tend to fit a personality type that's their dominant personality type, and that sometimes other things, like mostly you're a partisan voter but you're susceptible to campaign messaging, and sometimes you're a Democrat who votes for a Republican because campaign messaging from the Republican side activated your emotions strong enough that you actually did that particular kind of voting. But for the most part, people settle into their personality, their voting personality type, just as we kind of settle into our social personality type, our relationship personality type, our parenting personality type, our work personality type, and people know us as certain kinds of things. As voters, we tend to settle into one of these particular personality types. So, how do citizens decide who and what to vote for? They decide through the lens that their personality type gives to them. And where do they get that lens? They get that lens from what shortcuts to, not having to go all out and be the ideal citizen. What shortcuts make most sense to them, right? As I say, I'm largely a partisan voter, right? I'm somewhat of a rational voter and I'm somewhat of a reactive voter, but my main personality type is partisan. I tend to vote for Democrats. I'm a loyal Democrat. It doesn't mean I'm not well informed. Obviously I'm a political science professor. I know all kinds of stuff about what's going on, but I don't necessarily use all that information to make my decisions. I largely just vote for the Ds because I've determined and settled into this personality type that that tends to serve me. Right now, if there are disastrous Democrats that I wouldn't vote for, so I'm not just party line all the way down the line. And this is one of the reasons why I kind of understand and accept party line Republicans. I'm like, okay, like my brother-in-law is a Republican. He votes Republican most of the time because based on his values and interests, the Republican Party gives at least works towards the policies that he most approves of. And for him to vote Republican consistently, even though he's voting the opposite that I am, I totally understand it because we actually have the same personality type. We just break in the different direction. We tend to understand the personality types of other people, we tend to understand the voting choices of other people who match our personality type. Just like, extroverts tend to get along with extroverts, and extroverts and introverts tend to have trouble getting along. People who are rational voters have a hard time interacting with emotional voters. People who are ideological voters have a hard time interacting with people who are reactive voters because they're reacting to current circumstances, and ideology is about consistent, stable values, right? This is one of the things that leads to judgment and conflict in our democratic system, is that people with different personality types not only behave differently, but they tend to not see each other clearly or see each other with approval.